Shalom. How do we know what's the real Mount Sinai, and how do we know whether the Exodus really took place? There's a lot of scholars today, quote-unquote scholars, saying the Exodus didn't take place, but it seems like you need a lot of evidence to overturn a thousands-of-year-old tradition that's in the Bible and in the Quran and in every section of the Hebrew Bible, in almost every book of the Bible, in Jewish liturgy. What other nation at that period ever invented something bad about itself? It doesn't happen in literature. That's one of the arguments that it's true. And Richard Freund, professor at the University of Hartford, who wrote a wonderful book called Digging Through the Bible, one of his 6 books on Jewish archaeology, or just archaeology in general. He also has archaeology in here about Jesus and Mary. He concludes that there's as much evidence to say it happened as to say it didn't happen. And there's a lot of compelling evidence in this book, and I want to just summarize some of it, but really you should read the book. First of all, the Mount Sinai. I climbed Jabal Musa when I was at a youth group when I was 17. The supposed Mount Sinai. It's got this monastery there, and everybody, all the tourists. It's in the Sinai. See, it's not possible really for Jewish groups to climb it now, but it's probably not the Sinai. It's probably not Mount Sinai. Reason is that it's 350 miles or so from the Egyptian border, and according to the account of the Torah, the amount of time it would have taken the people, and he says in the book that people can walk about 5-6 miles a day with animals and donkeys and whatever else, could never have gotten there in time. And after excavating it for years and years and years and years, there's not one single piece of evidence that any big group was there. But there's another mountain that's in the southern Negev that's a much more likely possibility. Professor Anati of Italy found this mountain. He found 40,000 shards of rock art. Now, Hebrew was not invented as a language until 1000 BCE. And whatever view you take, the Exodus was certainly before that. But among these 40,000 pieces of rock shard at this other mountain in the Negev, which is north of the Sinai, there are pictures of menorahs and pictures of the rod that Moses used. Looks like the 10 Commandments. Quite possible. Now, in terms of the numbers of people that left, the Bible says there's 600 Eleph. And today we say Eleph means 1,000. So that gave the tradition of about 600,000 fighting men, which mean 2.2 million people. And it would be pretty easy to find evidence that 2.2 million people camped for a long time in the desert. There isn't any. However, the problem is with the translation of the word Eleph. It doesn't mean 1,000 in biblical times, because there's a story in Judges where Gideon was told to bring his Eleph, and he said, my Eleph is so small. It means clan. So if you figure 8 people or 10 people per clan, you're talking more like 4,800 people, which is a whole different kind of story. So based on that, there's a lot more evidence, and this particular mountain is only 250 miles from the Egyptian border, and so it's quite possible that this small group of people, let's say 5,000 people, could have moved in 250 miles in the amount of time the Bible says. Now, why was this place not known? Well, that's because of camels. Now, the Bible indicates that our patriarchs rode on camels, but that's an impossibility because there were no camels at that time in the area. Camels came in much later. They used donkeys. It also explains why, when it says about Abraham's journey, it says that he went up north, or north, and then south. Why did he do that? Not just cut across the desert. If they had camels, they could have done that. Because they didn't have any camels, they had donkeys, and donkeys have to stop and drink every 10 miles. So he'd take a longer route up north and then come south. By the way, it says Ur of the Chaldees. There were no Chaldeans in Ur at the time of Abraham. They didn't come for a long time afterwards. But when the writer was writing it, he put Ur of the Chaldees so that people would know what kind of Ur he's talking about, since there were several places called Ur. So back to the Exodus. What Bible scholars believe, and Professor Freund talks about in his book here, is that there were probably several Exoduses. One in the 13th century, perhaps another in the 15th, another in the 16th. And this is based on the documentary hypothesis of the Torah. So fundamentalists will reject this right away, but they're wrong, we believe. And you should watch my other video on the documentary hypothesis, JEP&D. He believes the P writer, writing, for example, in Exodus 14, is very exact about dates and places, said that in the 16th century BCE, the first Exodus, they took a northern route, and this is where they got to the Mount Sinai that Professor Anati believes is the Mount Sinai, and that's because at that particular time in the 16th century BCE, that was a safer route. When the story is told again about the 13th century in the Ramses era, they took a more southern route because it was safer in that time. Now, is there any other evidence besides the fact that who would invent such a negative story about themselves and the Mount Sinai story with rock art of Jewish art? Yes. There's a couple of stelas that are in the Cairo Museum. One is the Tempest Stela of Moses, I think the first they pronounce it, who talks about great plagues in Egypt. And they date that to around that time period. Now, what are the plagues based on? Well, every once in a while you read in the paper scientists who explain how the plagues could have occurred. Professor Freund suggests that most scientists believe it's volcanic eruptions of Santorini or Mount Vesuvius in the 17th or 16th century that could have led to the series of events that led to the plagues, including darkness and the Nile and all the other issues. Now, there's another stela, 13th century, from Merneptah, who says that Israel was laid waste. Well, they're not going to say that they took a defeat. Egypt was notorious for rewriting history. In fact, the Hyksos, which ruled them for 200 years, they completely wiped out of their record books. But we know the Hyksos ruled Egypt for 200 years because the Hyksos wrote letters outside the country. And they told the stories about leaving in a time of great plagues with a mixed multitude, which is language from the Bible. And there's other examples of pharaohs that the Egyptians later decided weren't good pharaohs or they didn't like them, so they just wrote them out of history. So it's easy to say that they would have tried to write the Israel successful rebellion out of history. And then you have the interesting situation of Ramses II, who ruled from 1279 to 1213 BCE, who would go outside the country and battle aggressively for 20 years, and suddenly he stopped and did not leave the country for 45 years after that, and his firstborn son died in mysterious circumstances. So, based on a lot of this, Professor Freund concludes there's as much evidence to say the Exodus did occur. It seems to me there's a lot of evidence to say the Exodus did occur, to say it didn't occur, and the mountain that I climbed, while a very interesting mountain, wasn't Mount Sinai, and probably this mountain in the Negev, Professor Anati, with the 40,000 pieces of rock art, including with menorahs and 10 Commandments, probably was more likely the mountain. And so we have, how do you tell which is the real Mount Sinai? How do you tell if the Exodus did happen or not? Well, I'd suggest you read Digging Through the Bible, which has lots of other gems besides this, to get a lot more information.